well, let's just
Yeah,
jump
Let's
into
let's.
save.
this. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Carl, and Ole and Jim Martin will be joining me on this very, very, very brief presentation this morning on pies. And the idea, of course, here, like we did last webinar, is this is intended to be interactive and discussion. These slides are just sort of to set the stage, and it's in no way exhaustive. So I'm going to go through these slides, maybe about 7 minutes or so, I think, and then we're going to open it up for discussion, lessons learned from you all. There's some questions at the end, and we don't have to stick to those questions. We could ask different questions if we want. So next slide. And I'm encouraging Ole and Jim just to jump in anytime. So I think everyone knows, or I think everyone knows what is PIES or biceps. And just so everyone knows, PIES is the concept that the Army and the Air Force use in the United States. Biceps is the concept that Marines use. For those of you who are familiar with the U.S. military, each service likes to do their own thing. And so this is just an example of that. But I think you'll see there's a lot of similarities. But the most important thing to take away from PIES or biceps, whatever you want to call it, is it's really just a simple motivational interviewing approach to return distressed soldiers quickly to duty. And this often includes lots of sleep, lots of rest, lots of nutritional, so you think about Maslow's hierarchy and you look at those bottoms. So you want sort of safety, you want food, you want nutrition. And that's really what PIES does. And it does this in a particular way, though, to include a relationship building that's really affirmative in that the expectation is that the service member, the soldier, the Marine will return quickly to duty. So, this is just a brief, and there's been papers written on this, and we're happy to share those. But it was developed during World War I by French psychiatrists. The trench warfare, manpower was an issue. It was rediscovered during World War II, again, when manpower was an issue, to how do we keep the soldier in the fight? How do we keep the soldier in the fight? And it serves as the basis of combat operational stress control for many militaries around the world. Okay, so it's almost been reified, and there is um, uh, published papers that support, in general, this concept of PIES. Next slide. These are exactly what the letters mean in PIES. So P stands for proximity, which means provide support near the unit. So you do not evacuate. You do not evacuate the soldier or the service member. You keep them right near the unit, and there are different uh, ways that can be done. Immediacy. So you want to intervene early. You don't want to wait until the problem becomes so severe that it requires evacuation. Okay, so this is the immediacy piece. The expectancy piece is tell the soldier you expect them to quickly recover and return to their unit. In other words, you don't want to offer up hope, oh, yeah, you're going to be going back home, right? Unless that's exactly what's going to happen. But then they enter the evacuation system. You don't want to over-identify with the soldiers. Oh, my goodness, you should be going home. I can't believe they're not letting you go home. You don't want to do things like that, because that then just sets in motion this, I am ill, I am sick, I need to leave the front. I need to leave my unit. Now, pi was what was developed during World War I by Colonel Salmon, but S was added later. S was really added during World War II, and that the S stands for simplicity. So you just use simple techniques. I mentioned it's really a motivational interviewing. It's sort of meeting the basic needs of the service member, which are usually rest, It's usually, good diet. They're in a safe place, relatively safe, because keeping in mind they're very still close to their unit, and their unit still may come under attack. So it's not completely 100% safe, but it's relatively safe. And you want to do a lot of listening and a lot of encouragement. Those should be the sort of the dominant features. Now, I just put for those who are curious, I'm not going to go over these in any detail, but the biceps, you can see what they stand for here: brevity, immediacy, centrality, expectancy, proximity, and simplicity. So you can see they're very, very, very similar to the concept of PIES. In fact, I would argue that there's fundamentally no difference between the two approaches. Next slide. However, there has been discussion about the ethical and moral issues around PIES, and especially in how it's implemented. And if you'll remember when Colonel retired Tony Cox spoke, he talked about this behavioral health care providers having two masters. And this is the typical dilemma that you see. So oftentimes what's doing best for the soldiers is not what's best for the military. And what's best for the military may not be what's best for the soldier. So while in the short term, the military may benefit by maintaining unit strength because the service member is kept far forward, they're quickly returned to their unit, the soldier may suffer from significant mental and physical health issues in the long term because they didn't receive that comprehensive, holistic support and care that they may have needed. So this is the moral and ethical challenges. Next slide. Now, I understand from talking to Oleg that this isn't really much of an issue in the Ukrainian situation, the Ukrainian war with Russia at the moment. But this was a significant issue in almost all of the studies that you read about a service member, a soldier being evacuated. And so we all know that there's a stigma associated with having a mental health issue. So I don't want to go into that in any detail unless folks are interested in discussing that. But there might even be a greater stigma and shame associated with being evacuated and returned home. And in many cases in the US, soldiers will feel guilty later for abandoning their comrades in need. And so this is just something that also has to be balanced. So in one case, you may look, you need to go home because of a mental health or behavioral health issue. And even a physical wound, you see this. But at the same time, they will be upset and angry perhaps later. And even sometimes there's ostracization among unit members towards someone who left their unit and was evacuated. And so these are also moral and ethical issues or considerations that we need to be very, very mindful of. Next slide. So, and by the way, this is my last slide. So the discussion here that we would like to spend really the bulk of our time doing is what are other issues that may be associated with implementing PIES in the current war in Ukraine? Can the implementation of PIES in the Ukraine be improved? If so, in what ways? Are there other rapid forms of intervention that might be employed to keep soldiers in the fight that maybe don't follow this concept of PIES as developed, well, almost 100 years ago now? Okay. Or I think it is over 100 years. I think just over 100 years. So I'm going to stop there and let Jim and Ole make some comments, and then let's just open it up to the entire all the participants to share their thinking, share their thoughts, ask questions. So I'm stopping.
Kyle, the only thing I guess I would add is the notion of reinforcing the idea that individuals not to be thought of or treated as casualties, that you want to maintain their sense of being a soldier, still, fully engaged. Um, and then the other issue for really discussion and to hear from our Ukrainian colleagues is the nature of this particular war and the way fighting is incurred. Um, what are the ways that these principles can and cannot be implemented? What's actually happening on the ground? I would love to hear from our colleagues about their experiences.
Yeah, Jim, that's a good point. And there's also, and Ollie, I saw your hand go. I just want to make, I forgot to make this one point. The U.S. system of evacuating casualties. So this is the point that Jim was making about casualties. Once a soldier or Marine enters the evacuation route, it's almost impossible to return them to their unit because of our evacuation system. I don't know if that is a similar system in the Ukraine, but it's almost impossible to return to your same unit. And we have data on that we collected. But paradoxically, when a service member is evacuated for a mental health issue, and we did this. I'm looking at Tony. Welcome. Tony Cox is joining us. Welcome, Tony. And Tony and I were part of a study where we looked at all of the mental health evacuations from Iraq. And what we found is that from a mental health perspective, the soldier got better the closer he got to home. So as he was being evacuated from his unit to the field hospital, to Landstuhl, Germany, to Walter Reed, they literally, you could see from the diagnosis and the assessment, the soldier was getting better. And so it just brings up the whole notion of, well, did the soldier need to be evacuated, right? And that's a legitimate question. But as they got closer to home, they got better. And that's been written up in our mental health advisory team report, and I can share that with you. But I just so you can see there are all kinds of these complicated issues that are involved in evacuating behavioral health casualties or mental health casualties, I think is what the broader term is in the Ukraine. And so we just need to be mindful of, are we really evacuating somebody who needs to be evacuated? So Ole, please jump in. I'm sorry. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you for this experience. Thank you for your experience, and thank you for this notion, because I was not aware about inability to come back to the same unit. So this nuance. Just want to say that PIES is great principles. I admire them a lot, and since the beginning of my service in brigade, or I was trying to constantly keep in mind these principles because they are like common sense, so everything it's relevant to pyramid of the level of psychological care. So as fast as close, it works. Several reflections, and I think my colleagues will also add some more. So today I'm abroad in one event, and international event, and talking with my international colleagues from Israel, Georgia, US, UK, Canada, and there are some features that probably are distinct from many other conflicts that happened during the last year. So we live in the country which is threatened, and we live in the context of total mobilization. So people with very different background coming to the army, and training usually is very short, and it means even psychological readiness and preparedness very often it's like not the same as when you have professional army, yeah? When you are trained, prepared, and have enough time to be like create strong sense of cohesion. So our cohesion created during the war, like while the unit is fighting, it creates cohesion on the way. Many soldiers now are fighting for more than 2 years. So a lot of combat fatigue. There is a lot of comorbidity because we have pretty much artillery and drone war. So a lot of MTBI, and very often it's multiple times. So I would say clear psychological reactions like acute stress reactions, like that usually happens in the first combat and not so much in the many others ones. So it's very rare thing. It happens, and I will tell one case that I was witnessing. We did not have enough training for combat medics when you are making triage. So even on stabilization point, like very often, like combat medics don't really distinguish, is it acute stress reaction or is it concussion with some psychological elements. So triage is not perfect. But we have a totally different evacuation system. So, and because we don't evacuate out of the country. So everything happens in the country and pretty close to the front line. Many, like there are levels of evacuation. So people can come from like Donetsk region to Lviv region in 1 or 2 days if it's needed, but very often it's neighborhood, let's say. And we don't, we have a unified medical space. So some soldiers, they are under treatment in civilian hospitals, and it's also out of safety reasons. So, and even it's not, maybe it's not required, but it can be required even to wear civilian clothes, not to be visible and become targets for drones or rockets. And what else? Maybe I will stay here and then I will add. So case what I was witnessing, I decided to make some, let's say, support on stabilization point, like 10 kilometers from the front line. Usually it's surgeons working there, also doctors who are paying attention to concussions, because it's very often, almost everybody, when they come from battlefield, they have this. And I've been asked to consult one guy. He was not from my brigade. And because he has acute stress reaction, and it was clearly, so the soldier was very young. He is combat medic. He was in like this pretty dissociative state. So like he was in freeze position. Even this event happened like he came from battlefield 2 days ago. So he was sitting, he was focusing, like we call stupor. So he was focusing one point. And I was using eye cover, but like little bit of eye cover, but of course it's not immediate intervention. So I was like, partially I was trying to make some contact, so he was constantly repeating the same stuff about what happened on the battlefield and what happened. So he got like usual about 1 month's combat training. But then when he came to the brigade, he was sent to his first combat, I would say, task with several of other guys, and he was responsible for their health as a combat medic, and it was very brutal. So few of his comrades were blown up because of artillery, and he saw death, like, you know, at very close distance, and he was overwhelmed for several days with everything that was going on. And then after that, he was evacuated with some other, maybe it was not even special evacuation, but just shifting the troops, and like militaries were shifting. And I was stabilizing him. So I was working with him on this stabilization point. We were walking. I was using my skills, like from body-oriented psychotherapy as well. And because it was very close to, still close to front line, every time he got some trigger, so for example, he started talking, he become more flexible in his body, and he like start looking for surroundings, so he like become more present. And then there was some sound, and he started again, you know, like lay down, hiding. So he came again in his like defensive positions. That is normal. And I asked his like comrade who was responsible for him, like doctors, but not doctor, but medical, but on higher level, like medic of battalion. And I asked, please don't evacuate him. So if you can make, so, and I was giving this type of advice, you know, keep him for 3 days, you know, like contact with him, like support him so he can, you know, like feel this connection and other stuff. And they did not make it, so they were too busy, so they sent him to psychiatrist. Psychiatrist sent him to the next level of evacuation, to Dnipro. I can see Svetlana here. So and I missed contact with him and with this doctor, but I took this as my personal, let's say, mistake or fault, that I was maybe was not insisting enough. So because I will try to connect with his this battalion medic, but in my opinion, it was like it was unfortunately breaking this PIES principle. So this is my short case. And please.
Ole, when you were talking, it reminded me of what happened in World War One. So because there was this huge pressure on troop strength, right? Because they've got hundreds of miles of line of trenches they're trying to maintain. Orders came down that no one gets evacuated for a mental health issue unless they show certain symptoms. One of them was catatonia. And so guess what? Catatonia, pseudo blindness, all of these things that would get people evacuated because they had to show them, they started showing them because there wasn't an ample rotation, a natural rotation to give folks a break from the front line. So one of the things that soldiers do, and I'm not saying they're doing this in a conscious way, and it could be very subconscious, that they start displaying those symptoms that they know that will get them evacuated off the front line, and not just, you know, using the pipe, but all the way to the rear. And I'm not sure what one can do about that other than not having such specified rules about what gets somebody evacuated versus what doesn't. I'm seeing Tony nodding, but Tony, please jump in. But I just wanted to share that this was an experience that was learned in World War One as well, and World War II, but really World War One is sort of the classic cases.
Yeah, and this is
thanks,
an
Carl.
issue for us, not having enough time for a reload. So yeah, sorry.
So Ole, I think you're spot on. So a couple of thoughts that I had, just kind of going back through the presentation. I've been taking some notes here. So the first one is Carl starts off by talking about how PIES has a moral dilemma to it. And part of the problem with moral dilemmas goes back to the whole fact that war itself is probably unethical and immoral. And so we, as commanders, we have to defend ourselves. We have to do things. And so, hold on a second. I'm getting a weird on my screen here. There we go. Sorry. Anyway, so so part of the issues with PIES is really a command concept. And how do we, as Carl spoke about, how do we kind of preserve the fighting strength? How do we conserve the strength up front? And so there's always a battle between who do we evacuate and who do we not. So let me give you an example. And they come in different kinds. I guess I would say there's a number of factors that come down to individual situations. There's societal factors, and then there's individual factors, which makes a perception of evacuation a good thing or a bad thing. So a couple of those are, for example, and Oleg, you mentioned that the situation in Ukraine is very different than the American situation in Iraq or Afghanistan. We were, everything was great at home. People are doing wonderful. Your girlfriend's going out to dinner. Everything's awesome. And you're at this faraway place, half a world away. And going to the rear sounds like a great thing. That's a very different place than what you guys are in, which is an all-in situation. I mean, you guys are under general mobilization, and you're defending your homeland, which is a very humongous bigger motivation to stay, to want to be in the trench and to want to stay there. So that's a factor. The nature of the war itself, trench warfare versus a mobilized warfare. When troops are moving, for example, if you kind of looked at the numbers, when Patton was charging across Europe in his tanks, he didn't have an awful lot of combat stress casualties because they were in the nature of offensive war. When you're moving and you're rolling and you're progressing, people are kind of in on that. It's kind of like being on the winning team. And that's a very different place than if you're happen to be on the losing team, or if you're in a situation where you're in static line and it just seems like after a while there's no one's winning or losing, just like it's a stalemate. And so there's those psychological pressures there. And then there's the psychological individual makeup of the people. So there's some people who by nature, and again, it's a spectrum, but there's some soldiers, some people who are kind of like all in no matter what. They're kind of team players. They want to be part of the group. They want it. They like cohesion. They're involved. And then there's other people who really aren't that they don't really care. They're more in for themselves. And so it's kind of like, it's like when you look at an individual person. Let me give you an example. So when I spent about 16 months in Iraq on my third tour, and we were basically doing detainee operations. I was part of a combat stress control hospital that was in charge of all the detainees during the surge. We had about 27,000 detainees we were responsible for. So believe it or not, I only evacuated 2 people the entire 16 months. One person had very bad suicidal ideation, and we just couldn't find a way to manage it very well. The other person, believe it or not, was my psych nurse. So here's this guy, and I want to tell you about this guy. So we got to theater. We flew in to theater. We were there about 2 weeks, and this guy was kind of this hippie guy from Hawaii. He was a single guy, was playing it up good. He lived in Hawaii, was signed to Tripler, and he was my psych nurse. And he was he came and he said, he goes, I know you don't believe this, but I'm suicidal. And I interviewed him. I had a couple other people interview him, and we all decided that he was completely lying. So the commander, I got with the commander, and we had a discussion, and the commander's like, I think we should keep him here. And I said, no, I think we should send him home. And I said, because I've already talked to all the other people in the unit. They think he's a bum, and they just want him out of here. So it's kind of like a consensus between, it could have been that if we'd have sent him home, that other people would have said, hey, that's my ticket out of here. But in his case, they didn't like him. They didn't want him on the team. He didn't want to be on the team. He wanted to go back to Hawaii. And so in that case, just his individual makeup and the cohesion in the team just wasn't a mix for him. No one else in our entire unit got evacuated the whole 16 months we were there. We had about 200 or 300 or 400 people. So it was a sizable unit with no other mental health evacuations. But that was just, so it's kind of the makeup of the individual and how those things come about. Finally, I would say that one of the things you want to be careful of is when you pull people out. So part of the expectation is that individual assessment that you have to do with the individual is, when you're doing your PIES interview and you're doing kind of checking out the person and how they're fitting in, you want to look at cohesion and see, is there cohesion in the unit? Did they wish to be part of that unit? Do you see them want to stay in the unit? Now they may be having symptoms. They can't sleep. They're having tremendous anger, whatever those symptoms are. But there is their base desire to be with the unit, or is their base desire to not be with the unit? And you have to kind of figure that out. And then it becomes a management tool. How do we kind of not let him go to where he sucks a bunch of people with him? But at the same time, do you want to keep a guy on the front lines who doesn't want to be part of the team? Because that person will insidiously break up the team cohesion, and eventually so other soldiers will turn on them if they're too little of a team player, if they're really kind of always whining and complaining and not getting along, and so you have to kind of balance all that out as to whether you evacuate them, or do you switch them out to a different unit, or do you try some different things? And when we talk about evacuation, you don't necessarily have to evacuate them clear to the rear. It may well be that they just need to move from a line unit into a support unit, or maybe to a different line unit. Maybe just they have bad blood with some of the other people in that unit, and they'd be fine in a different combat unit, but they just need a new take. So it's a really kind of an assessment at the individual level about what you want to do. I would also say you want to be a little bit careful. And Ole, this is one of the interesting things too that Carl mentioned out of World War I. They set up an entire combat stress fatigue or battle fatigue set of hospitals that was parallel to the regular evacuation. One of the things that they found was that it was important to keep soldiers who had battle fatigue, etc., to keep them in the system. So, like, I know you're putting them in civilian hospitals, but as soon as soldiers get civilian clothing on and they're now amongst the civilian population, you lose some of that expectancy, that kind of constant drive. It's like you're still a soldier. It's important to be a soldier. This is just a temporary problem, and as soon as you kind of get it together, kind of these symptoms wane a little bit. You're going back because once you kind of get into that more civilian setting, it becomes so much easier then to kind of just kind of let go of your unit, let go of the desire to be military, and just kind of fade into the woodwork. Anyway, that's some thoughts.
Let's open it up to the rest of the attendees. Any reactions, comments? I can't read the Ukrainian language, but I'm sure you all can. So, Ole, we'll let you moderate whether or not folks want to say something or read a question or comment in the text section.
Yeah, I will switch to Ukrainian channel. Так, колеги, будь ласка, тобто ми змінили трошки формат, ми менше хочемо такого академічного стилю, лекційного. О, я бачу підняті руки, чудово. І ми, власне, заохочуємо до таких дискусій,
and we
бо в
encourage you
дискусії
to
народжується
discuss,
істина.
because that's when the truth comes out in the discussion. Sergey Boyko, please.
Добрый день, меня слышно,
Good day. Can you hear me?
Так, слышно, да? Да, отлично.
Great.
Ситуация, в общем, такая, да?
So the situation
Я
is
офицер,
as follows.
психолог,
I'm an officer, psychologist,
в прошлом действующий психолог, сейчас уже
former sitting
в запасе.
psychologist, now
Но
retired.
так как я непосредственно работал с
But
солдатами на
I directly
передовой
worked with
и в
soldiers at the
пункте
front
временной
line
дислокации и так
and
далее,
at the center of
у меня сформировался один интересный парадокс.
deployment. I
С одной
have come
стороны,
across a paradox.
можем
On the one hand,
оставить солдата,
we can leave the soldier,
которого выводим из, условно говоря, из
we pull
окопа
out
в связи
from
с
the front line
как
with
психогенную потерю. Вот.
psychogenetic
С другой стороны,
loss.
и
On
оставить
the
его в
other hand,
подразделении, там,
and we can leave him
с
within
другой
the
стороны,
unit. On
другие
the other
солдаты,
hand,
которые
other
будут видеть,
soldiers
что
that will
таким
see
образом
that
они могут
this is the
избежать
way they can
пребывания
use
в
to
окопах,
avoid the service at the front line, they start to demonstrate similar symptoms.
Как бы это правильно сказать? В общем, похожее поведение, например,
similar behavior, for example,
это может создавать
and this can cause conflict within the unit between different soldiers at different levels.
И тут для меня лично непонятно,
For me, I don't understand which option is more acceptable in such a situation. Thank you.
Well, I would just opine that this is where your assessment is so important. You have to get involved with the unit. You have to know the unit. You have to know the command. And I don't mean know them. Obviously, there's lots of units and commands, but taking the time to understand the situation, the individual, understand the team, understand how much cohesion there is or not. I mean, if you're with a group of people you really don't like, your desire to leave is going to be greater. There may be other people who really want to be part of the team, and the other people may want to get away too. So, kind of understanding, and then you have to decide. This is the heart of the dilemma. Is in the Army, we're Carl and I and Jim were taught years ago this old expression, which is mission first, men always. And commanders have to weigh that. It's a constant weight. It's like, how do I accomplish my mission and at the same time take care of my guys in an environment where the mission itself is inherently dangerous and could end up killing or maiming or forever hurting my soldiers. But I have to accomplish that mission. And that's the dilemma. I mean, we send soldiers are in the trench today, and they're going to be fired upon, and they're going to receive rocket fire and all kinds of they're going to get that, and they could die, or they could end up having their arms or legs blown off, as we all know. And the same thing's going to happen psychologically. The problem is as commanders, we cannot let all of our people go. And so we have to, so we're constantly balancing, how do I keep people on the front line who are capable of accomplishing the mission? Just like if you could do without a finger, I might keep you on the front line. Can you do without an arm? Probably not. So there's this kind of balancing. It's like, at what point do you evacuate an injury, and at what point do you evacuate a psychological injury? And then what does that do to everybody else involved? And that's an individual situational assessment that has to happen every time there's one of these cases.
Tony, thank you. I don't want to create this format when some Ukrainian share his case and then a US professional try to supervise. So now we're not making advisor or a supervisor. So let's just keep free flow. And I can see the hand of my dear friend and colleague Panda.
Всім вітання.
Hello, everyone.
Я хотів би сказати, що тут є у нас
I would like to
нюанс
say
таких,
that
є два моменти.
we
Перший
have
момент – це
two issues here. The first one is the need for differentiated diagnostics.
Скажімо так, стресовий
When we are
розлад
talking about
бійців, то тут
stress
можуть бути два
disorder
варіанти.
with the
Тут, про
soldiers,
що
we have two
говорилося і
options
натякалося.
here.
Перший – це симуляція,
The first one is
а
simulation,
другий – це
and the
дійсно
second one
існуючий,
is a real
розлад. І якщо
disorder.
ми знаходимо
And
симуляцію, тут,
if
звісно
we
ж,
see that
той
there's a
алгоритм,
case
про
of
який говорилося,
simulation,
залишити
then we have
його в
the
окопі, туди й
algorithm
т.п.
to
Він
leave the
тут,
person in
це
the
питання,
trench.
можливо, дискутабельне, але це тут можна говорити.
It's
Якщо
a
ж ми
debatable
маємо
question,
розлад, реальний розлад,
but
без
if we have a
симуляційних
real
жодних цих,
disorder
то
without any
згадаємо ще
simulation,
Ясперса, який говорив, що для того, щоб
let's get back to
вилікувати
Jaspers.
стресу
He said to cure
якийсь
stress
розлад, маємо позбутися
or
джерела.
stress-associated
Неможливо
disorder, we
вилікувати
have
в
to
умовах
get rid
стресу.
of the source.
Тобто, як на
You
мене, то
can't
всі
cure it within
пацієнти наші, всі
the
бійці з
stress
виявленими розладами
environment.
стресового цього,
So
вони
all our
мусять бути
soldiers with
відведені.
this kind of
На мою
stress, they
думку,
have
по
to
моїй
be pulled
практиці,
out. In my
шкідливим
opinion,
є
in my
виведення з
practice,
підрозділу.
pulling out from the unit is what is bad, but the soldier has to be pulled out from the position, but stay within the unit. What is also important is the cooperation with psychiatrists, because in most cases, medical drugs are effective. Medication helps to reload the resources, recharge the person, and the person then can go back to combat environment. And what a psychologist should do in our Ukrainian realities, it's difficult within our realities to get to the psychiatrist. So the task psychologists have is to organize this process of accompanying the soldier to get to the psychiatrist and explain that the soldier needs help, needs a prescription, needs like 3 or 4 days to get back on track, and later we'll see whether we need something else. Practice shows that 50% of such soldiers return to the front line, and 30% of them do not contact the doctor.
Ігор, я бачу твою руку, зараз дам можливість. Я тільки хочу просто відреагувати на те, що Панда сказав, щоб застосувати оцей фільтр принципів PIES, так? Тобто по великому рахунку підтримується принцип proximity, близькості, є принцип expectancy, є принцип... Тобто перші 3 принципи підтримуються, але наші реалії через те, що і бойова втома тривала, і через те, що коморбідність, не завжди виходить підтримати принцип simplicity, тобто простоти. Тобто вже коли додається медична допомога, так, по суті, це вже не про simplicity, це вже трошки складніше. Тут виходить нюанс. Ігор, будь ласка.
Good day to everyone. I would like to discuss another aspect and hear an answer, because this principle is applied to the situation that has already happened. We have a problem and we try to solve it with the use of some algorithm. I would like to talk about a different thing, about the preparation of soldiers. Because we have this short period of training, and resilience to combat stress is not that developed, and it's key. Because when a person is moving to the front line with their expectations or fears and then faces terrible reality, that's when this reaction comes on. Most of people start reacting in this way. They're very afraid.
And then the situation is this. All of us in this way or another, consciously or unconsciously, they start avoiding performing their duties. This burden is delegated to other people, and then we have 50% of a unit that is super exhausted because they have the main burden, because of those who do not do that, and then they have running nose or some pain in the joints. So I would like to speak about importance of this kind of preparation, because integration of this preparation or training component, I believe it could really mitigate this issue, not resolve the issue, but mitigate it. Because now I am working with an officer who has his leave, and he's so afraid to go back to the front line. And he's an officer, he should be a role model. But he's so afraid. He's afraid to receive an order to move somewhere with the unit. This is what I'm thinking about, because now to a great extent I believe this is a way to achieve some success. Thank you, that's reasonable. Let me try and conceptualize or sum up what you mentioned, and we could speak about prevention, right, in this sense. To a great extent, training, preparation, this is primary. Prevention, while PIES and other intervention, that's secondary prevention, and addressing long-term consequences, PTSD, that's tertiary prevention. And the more investment in primary prevention, the easier further on. Because even at that event that I attended abroad, we discussed there that in long-term protracted conflicts, that's about our experience, and Israeli colleagues, they also say that the situation is such that for primary prevention, we don't have that many opportunities to do that. Often that takes the form of ongoing secondary prevention. What I can see how my guys do that, I mentioned the case of the guy who was immediately, as soon as he arrived, thrown under the tank, so to say. And new people come, they are afraid, that's natural. They have not yet acquired that mental identity. They may be, well, we know that in 2024, we don't have that many people who voluntarily go to the front line, right? But if the unit accepts them well, welcomes them, organizes kind of introductory orientation activities in the unit where they first perform less hazardous tasks and so on and so forth. So if by the unit helps them integrate, then we can speak about secondary prevention and kind of training, on-the-job training, if I can put that this way. Yuri, the floor is yours.
Oleg, I got a quick question. Is most of the replacements done individual replacements, not unit replacements?
Я би сказав, що практично тільки так.
I would say that is the only way how it's happening.
Ця практика, яку ще
Jonathan Shea описував в Одіссеї, described in
як така не зовсім правильна.
For Odysseus, for Achilles, well, maybe that's not quite right. When 10 people withdraw and 10 people come and then they're distributed there. Unfortunately, we have that. That's what we have, and we don't have this more organized replacements. But it happens that the brigade has been there for many months, and you don't have enough people basically to perform combat, the activities, or well, then there may be this replacement unit by unit.
Yuri, будь ласка.
Yuri?
Just a quick follow-on. There's something between individual replacement and replacing an entire unit, and that would be the concepts of individuals coming in small groups, 2, 3, 4, 5, into a unit at the same time, so that no soldier goes alone. He's with somebody that he already has a relationship with. And I don't know whether anyone has looked at that in Ukraine as a way of trying to deal with the replacement needs at the same time, making sure that it's not a single individual showing up by themselves to a new unit. I don't know whether that makes sense to you or not.
Ну, зазвичай прибувають там 10-20
Usually they do arrive like 10 or 20, they join a unit, and after the training center, it rarely happens that they really come individually. Usually that's how it's happening.
Good.
I would agree with the two previous speakers. And let me also speak about importance of support from the commander, and if there is the atmosphere of trust, there will be less fear, I guess. Regarding the treatment health facilities, after treatment, unfortunately, the sound is not good. So often after treatment of traumas, people are reluctant to come back and try to avoid that.
Я бачу коментар, і, власне,
I
пишуть,
see
що наразі
a
на відновлення
comment,
відправляють по батальйонам, про
and
бригади
now
не
they
йдеться.
say that
Ну, я
they
представник, я працюю на рівні
they
бригади, того,
rotate
ну, в нас
battalions,
інший
not
досвід.
brigades. I work at the brigade level, so
Є
for us
окремі
the
там батальйони,
experience is
стрілецькі
different.
батальйони,
If
наприклад,
there are
то, ймовірно,
individual
по батальйонам,
battalions
ну,
like
можливо, у вас
shooters
інший досвід.
battalions, well,
Але,
maybe
до
you
речі,
have
це
different
теж цікавий
experience,
фактор,
but
якщо ми
by the way,
говоримо...
that's also an
Це
interesting
вже ми трошки
factor.
виходимо, певно, за межі
And
ну,
here
початкової
we
дискусії
are
про
speaking
PIES,
about
але
a
про
bit
дійсно
different thing,
відновлення
not
по
PIES
батальйону,
or
бригадно,
other methods.
окремо,
But if we
там,
speak about
індивідуальні,
this
так,
replacement,
речі.
battalion by battalion or
Наш
brigade by
досвід,
brigade
там,
or
моєї бригади,
individually,
і там,
our
спілкуючись
experience
з товаришами
of
там, з
my
інших
brigade,
бригад,
and when I talk to
звичайно,
people
коли
from
це
other
все
brigades,
цілісно відбувається, коли
of
ви
course, if all
виводите
of that
військову
happens in
частину,
an
умовно, чи там
integrated
цілий
way,
підрозділ, то це набагато краще потім навіть у
so if
взаємодії. В нас
the
були
rotation
ситуації, коли
happens
там
on the
дехто лишався під
unit
часовим
level, that's much
яром,
better. We had
і потім
situations
це
where
було,
somebody
ну,
stayed
перше, і
near
люди
Chasiv Yar,
отримували
and
ніби зовсім
there
інший досвід
people
порівняно з іншими батальйонами
get
бригади, які
very
були на
different
відновленні.
experience
І,
compared
мабуть,
to
таке
other
розривання взагалі
battalions of the
зв'язків, так,
brigade
чи
who
це
were
індивідуальних, чи
rotated.
це
So this is
таких
about
групових, я думаю,
severing the
це
ties,
завжди
individual
несе
or group
негативний
ties. I
психологічний
believe
ефект.
that always psychologically
Я
results
можу
in
бути
negative
категоричний, але
consequences. Maybe I am
кажу.
too blunt saying that, but that's what I observe.
Думки, коментарі, ми можемо знов так плавно десь повернутися
Any
до PIES.
ideas,
Бачу, пані Олену,
comments?
будь
I
ласка.
believe we can go back to discussing PIES, right?
Вітаю вас.
Олена?
Я
Hello.
психолог,
I am
начальник
a
групи психологічного
psychologist.
супроводу і
I'm head of
відновлення.
group of
І хотіла
psychological support
розповісти
and
випадок,
recovery,
який
and I
трапився в
wanted to
моїй
share a
практиці.
situation with you,
Я
something
виїхала в
that
зону
I
бойових
had in
дій.
my practice. I went to
Батальйон
combat
перебував
area,
там уже
and the
понад
battalion had
півроку,
been
і
there
люди були
for more than
виснажені.
6 months.
І мене
People were
попросили
exhausted.
попрацювати з
And they
6
asked me
людьми,
to work
які,
with
по
6
суті,
guys,
відмовились виконувати поставлену
basically
задачу. І ми
refused
просто в цей
to
день якраз приїхали, і
implement
так
the
співпало, що
task to follow the order.
я почала
So
розпитувати, що
it happened
відбувалося, як
so that on
відбувалося
the
і так
same
далі.
day we came,
Одна
when that
людина,
happened, and I started asking
люди
them
були в
about what
такому
was
стані,
happening.
що
So
говорити
people
про
were in
первинний
the state
скринінг,
that speaking about
було
primary
дуже складно.
screening was
Тому я
not
обрала
possible.
такий підхід, що
That is why
індивідуально
I
я
decided
спланувала,
to
що я
work
поспілкуюсь хоча б декілька
individually.
хвилин з
I
кожним, а потім
decided
будемо
that I will
вирішувати,
have
що
at least a
робити
couple of
далі.
minutes with
І
each
коли
of
я
them
почала
individually,
працювати
and
з
then
першим
we decide
бійцем,
what we
у
do
нього
next.
почалась
And when
істерика.
I
Та як він
started
зайшов, у
working with
нього
the
був
first
уже тремор
soldier,
рук,
he went
тремтіння
hysterical. When he
тіла,
entered, he
і
had
коли
tremor,
він
he
почав
was
говорити, у
shaking,
нього
trembling,
одразу він
and
перейшов
when
на
he
істерику.
started speaking, he
І для
started
мене
being
було досить
hysterical.
складно,
And
тому що
it
я
was
розуміла,
quite
що
hard for
5
me
інших
because
осіб
I
стоять за дверима
realized
і
that
чують цю
5 other
істерику,
people were standing
але
behind
я
the door
продовжувала з ним
hearing
працювати, я
this
його
hysteria,
переключила
what was
трошки на
going
інший
on, but
вид
I
діяльності,
continued working with him. I
але
helped
я
him
розуміла,
focus
що
on a
ця
bit
людина
different
просто настільки
activity.
виснажена, що
But I
вона не
realized that
здатна
the
далі за
person
3
was
дні,
so
якщо відправити її
exhausted
на пункт
that
психологічної
after
допомоги,
3 days, if
я
he
мала
goes
сумніви, що
to
вона
this
відновиться. Це
psychological
був перший. І
recovery point,
одразу
I
за
had
ним
doubts
прийшов
that over
наступний,
those 3
також
days
само
he would
тремтіння
recover.
рук дуже
Then
сильне,
the next
і в цей
one
час почали
entered again
недалеко
with
працювати
tremor.
гради.
And at that point, we could hear grad shelling. And when that happened, his body started really trembling, shaking. I asked him, what do you do usually when that happens? He says, we need to go to a garage to that pit, but it is stinky. I will not go there. I'd better put a grenade, a shell under my body. I mean, I cannot really, I can no longer stay in these circumstances, in these conditions. Other cases were more or less operational. Others, the situation of the rest of them was better. And even though it was not my battalion, but I came up with my opinion. As a result of the interviews for the first guy, I believe it was acute stress reaction. Well, that's my vision. I could be mistaken, but anyway. And in the second case, regarding the second soldier, I believe that it was quite unsafe for that guy to stay in the unit. A month after, I met both of them in Cherkasy, already in the area in psychoneurological clinic. I could not even recognize one of them because he looked so different. He looked much younger, taller. I mean, even physically, his physical dimensions seem to have changed. So, I mean that sometimes there are the situations that you need to quickly make a decision, while commanders, in those cases, they suspect that people are pretending. And this line where this is pretending, pretension, and where people need help, that's a very thin line, especially if unless there was specialized training on those issues. So in some cases, a psychologist has to undertake this responsibility and make this decision and then be liable and responsible for that. Thank you.
Супер важлива
That's
тема.
very important, the theme where the line is.
Повертаючись до
And now, again, going back to what Carl said, what Tony said about the moral dilemma, so to say, how to satisfy both parties, both sides. I mean, to provide help, but also to make sure that the unit remains operational. And I had a similar situation. Often when I go to a unit where people refuse to follow the orders, we refer to them in a biased way. There is this word, denigrating word, відмовники. But when you try to understand their mental status, of course, that's very hard. And I already conducted quite comprehensive interviews and examinations to have some evidence base that people need to have better conditions. Maybe they need to have access to doctors or they need to be rotated. So I check them for depression, anxiety, NSI, blast wounds. But now I also add assessment of psychological ready for combat based on Oleg Gukovsky's approach to show how that correlates. I mean that poor mental state is reflected on their further capacity to work. So that seems to be more understandable for commanders. And now I see Sergey, Panda, and Carl at the next one. Can I?
Так, Сергію, кажіть.
Можна, да. Дивіться, моє таке питання виникло до лектора американського, який говорив, що в нього був випадок, коли він спілкувався з військовим і виявив, що той симулює, і він все ж таки вирішив його відправити, перемінюючи його до звичайних санітарних втрат. То у мене виникає таке питання. По-перше, де в нього така виникла впевненість, що він симулює, яку методику
When do you have confidence that the person is simulating? And the second one,
якщо він знав, що він симулює,
if the person knew that the soldier was simulating, so did his comrades, so by sending him, by pulling him out from the front line, from combat environment, thus giving a sign to other people, other soldiers, that they can avoid
Враховуючи ті
duties.
обставини, які перепроживають хлопці
Given
на
these
лінії бойового
realities that
зіткнення,
the
то
frontline guys
жахливий
live in,
тваринний страх, то, звісно, тут не
terrible
йдеться не про
fear.
якісь там високі цілі,
So it's not about
незважаючи на виховання, здебільшого
goals.
людей все ж таки намагаються симулювати і більше не
So
повертатись
some people
туди, і
try to
всіми силами
simulate
якось
and avoid
намагаються
going back to that
уникнути
place
цього
as
виконання
much as they can
безпосередньо на бойових діях.
to
Тому у мене таке
dodge
питання виникає
combat
все ж таки,
missions.
чи не думає він, що таким чином він дає
So
приклад і можливість
doesn't the person think
іншим
that
в подальшому
this
симулювати
situation
все ж
sets
таки
an
і для
example
того,
for
щоб
other
уникнути
soldiers
бойового завдання?
and allows them to simulate?
Я тоді
Thank you.
попрошу, певно, Тоні відповісти, бо це таке
I
пряме питання, а
would
тоді
ask
вже
Tony
повернемося до
to
Панди і до Карла.
give the answer to this question.
So I think it comes back to some of those principles we spoke about. So in the case, so picture the huge difference between. So we were a unit that was coming in. We'd been there only a couple weeks, so everybody was in good, pretty good shape. So we not, we weren't fatigued. Second of all, our mission, we weren't nearly as high a risk. So we were basically in a base camp area taking care of detainees. So the risk of getting killed, we literally lost no soldiers at all. So our 450 unit lost no one. We had a couple injuries, but no one was significantly injured or killed during the time we were there. So the circumstances, and this is where it makes a huge difference. If I had that same soldier and I was on the front lines in Ukraine, I absolutely would not have allowed him to go home. Whereas in the case where we were at, where he was actually a detriment to the unit, the other people wanted to be there. They saw him as being a detriment to the unit because he was going to pull down morale, and so they were happy to see him go. If on the other hand we needed every person we could have, and there was a risk that he would have pulled others with him, I absolutely would have kept him in theater. So it's just different circumstance.
Дякую.
Окей, якщо можна,
One of the
я
things.
би, власне, хотів, це дуже класно, що ми от говоримо зараз за,
It's
піднімаємо
good that
таку
we
тему і
can
обговорюємо,
talk
як
about this
допомагати,
issue,
яка перша
discuss it,
допомога
how to
психологічна
help.
при
It's the
стресі і тому
first aid
подібне, але
should
мені
be
здається, що ми
during
дуже
such
мало
stress,
уваги
but
приділяємо
what
превенції.
we pay little attention to is
Превенції того. І
prevention.
як на мене, то тут є в нас
Prevention of
досить такі
such
можливості,
situations.
бо насправді,
We have
якщо провести,
some capabilities here
той самий скринінг чи ті самі
because
дослідження
if we
бійців,
screen
то в будь-кого,
and
навіть самого
study
з
the
низькою
soldiers,
стресостійкістю,
even
все
the
рівно
person
є
with
якісь
the
ресурсні,
least
ресурсні
stress
штуки в кожного
resistance
бійця.
have
І,
some
як на мене, то, власне,
resources, internal
одним з варіантів
resources.
такої превенції могло би бути
So
дослідження
an option of
бійців,
such
які ще не були в
prevention
бойових діях. Тут
is to study
тобто психолог
soldiers that
батальйону
have not yet
повинен
participated in
проговорити з
combat
кожним
operations,
індивідуально, визначити його
talk to them together
характеристики, його
individually
тип
to
і
define
його
their
можливості, як
characteristics, their
реалізувати
features,
його ресурсні можливості
and
у
streamline
стресових
his
ситуаціях, стресових випадках.
internal resources
Того,
in
чого в нас, на жаль, не
stress-related
проводиться.
situations. This is the thing we lack.
Ми можемо говорити
We
і за
don't
якісь
have it.
групові такі
We can
якби
talk
речі, але якщо
about
ми це би ще
group
робилося
sessions
індивідуальному
that
порядку, це було б просто
had it been
чудово.
done,
Може, в
were
когось є
done
якісь
individually.
ідеї з
It would
цього.
be great.
Це я так
Have
завертаю більше
someone has
до профілактики
ideas. That's yes, I'm talking
можливих
more about
стресових
prevention.
уражень. Дякую.
Ну, я бачу купу піднятих рук, ну і Ігор про це
I
говорив,
see many hands
про
raised.
профілактику,
Igor
то
talked
все
about
добре
it, the
завертаєш,
prevention.
звичайно, краще
So
профілактика, ніж
it's
це.
better.
І я думаю, що це добре ще таке питання, власне,
And it's
яким чином
a
дійсно
useful
оцінювати
question.
запас міцності,
How
так?
to
Тобто ми
assess
оцінюємо через вже поломку,
the
через там якусь
capabilities of the
психопатологію, яка
person.
виникає,
Do we
наприклад, як там
assess it
психіатри
through a
чи
trauma,
психологію. А
through
як
what has
от цей
already
запас
happened?
міцності
But how to
бачити
assess how
і
much,
от не
how many
наблизитись до те,
resources,
що
how much
є в
strength the
континіумі до
person
червоного
has
кольору, до тих вже до
before they
стану
get
хвороби.
to the
Будь ласка, я не
state,
побачив.
to the bad
Карл, потім Юрій, потім
Carl, please.
Сергій.
Oleg, the concept of prevention obviously is very appealing because if we can prevent anyone from having a combat stress reaction or a combat breakdown or suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, that would be wonderful. The reality is it's very, 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 very difficult. Okay. So the compromise, given that prevention is almost impossible, true prevention, we do early intervention. And that's what PIES is. PIES is a very, very early intervention. Remember, right when the symptoms start emerging, not when they become severe, not when they're catatonic, but when they start emerging. And sort of signs you look for is poor hygiene, isolation, malingering, right? Little slow to follow orders, a little slow to move to the front, a little slow to expose yourself to enemy fire. Those are the signs that one looks for in these early intervention PIES framework. So PIES is sort of the compromise, given that we can't do true interventions that we would like to do. Of course, we would all love to do that. We would all love to do that. But the reality is, doing that kind of work, getting evidence-based interventions, we do try to do things like Tony mentioned and you mentioned, Ole, about cohesion and morale and leadership. These are all forms of prevention. But what PIES is, though, is an early intervention. So it's not treatment. It's not waiting for them to need pharmacological medications. That's beyond PIES, right? That's beyond PIES. So PIES is sort of that, we're not really sure how to do prevention, and we've got this manpower issue. Can we do these early interventions to sustain people? Now, whether or not keeping someone on the front line ends up resulting in long-term negative health effects, we don't know that either, but it's possible. One could argue logically it's likely. So I just want to emphasize that prevention is obviously what we'd all like to do, but it's really difficult. And we need to, in the absence of that, sort of what can we do in the earliest point of intervention that we can do that's a non-mental health intervention, if that makes sense. Ole, is this you putting these slides up?
Yeah. I just wanna I just wanna make awareness about, again, mental health continuum. We were talking in one webinar, yeah. So that we work in orange zone. So we try with PIES, we try to prevent illness. Yeah, we try to prevent red zone. This is what I wanted to show. And please, Yuri Sidorek. Не бачу вже Юрія. Сергій, будь ласка, у вас піднята рука.
Юрій. Дякую. Я просто що згодився продукувати питання попереднього мого побратима, тобто стосовно
I'd like to answer the question of my comrade in regard to training and identifying stress resistance of soldiers. Given that I've undergone from training center, the process from training center, now then I was in the position of psychologist, so I have experience both as a military and having education as a therapist, I think that our army does not provide time, does not pay attention to training the personnel. And being in the position of a psychologist in the army, I tried to study this issue. And I was looking for ways how to help the personnel, how to prepare them. So, of course, I would like to identify and prevent any situations from happening and analyze all the boys. But unfortunately, it is impossible in these conditions. But having worked with many people, I interviewed more than 300 people, and then I followed them during combat missions. I found out that of the utmost importance is the fact that we have talked about it with them. This psychological education is very important. They know of the consequences they might suffer. I've come across two factors. There's the risk zone, which rises the occurrence of PTSD. Given that women are more neurotic and they're susceptible to such factors, and they suffer from PTSD more often, and if you don't have education. So when you have no education, so the questions, what will happen to me, what will I do, this influences you very much. So this psychological education is of utmost importance at the training stage. Psychologically prepare soldiers, telling them about what might happen to them, so they can go through various options how to react. Our specialists have modernized these techniques. What can happen to me while I'm in these conditions? Thank you.
Дякую, Юрій, будь ласка.
Thank you, Yuri. Please.
Хотів би так підтримати колег. На мій погляд і мій досвід показує, що психолог не буде всюди, але є можливість працювати або доручити місію молодшим командирам.
There is an opportunity to work with a commander. So the prevention part can be conducted with the commanders, junior commanders. This is the most viable option for prevention. Thank you.
Мабуть, і командири, так, я на правильному каналі, і командири, і в Америці це називається помічники поведінкового здоров'я, behavioral health technician. В нас більш популярна британська система в деяких бригадах TRIM, коли побратими можуть там розпізнати, там, вчасно підтримати, там, чи порекомендувати звернутися до психолога. І це є перший рівень
This is the first level of help.
Туди треба, звичайно, найбільше зусиль інвестовувати.
This
Тобто
is
самодопомога
where
і
most efforts are
психодукація туди
needed.
носить, бо тоді ти озброєний певними навичками і
Then you
знаннями.
have certain skills and knowledge
Допомога побратима, допомога
as how to
командира.
help,
Це базовий рівень, і якщо
help by a
підрозділ
comrade and help
згуртований,
by a
це дуже
commander.
потужна
If the
підтримка, і
unit
дуже
is
багато
in
хлопців, з якими я
cohesion,
спілкувався,
this
казали,
helps
що
a
я би
lot.
вже
Many
100 разів пішов
soldiers
в СЗЧ,
told
якби
me
не
that
мої
they
оці
would have
хлопці,
left
заради
and
яких я
dodged
тут і стою.
everything but for
Панда,
the
Можна я відреагую
comrades?
на Юру два слова, тому що Юра говорив про
Can I
первинне
react to Yura's
виявлення.
action?
Так, це є важливе, але
Primary
це, мені здається,
identification is
трошки інакша
important,
едукація,
but
або первинна психогігієна і раннє первинне виявлення тими
primary
самими командирами,
education
тими всіма, це є два
and
різних етапи, як на мене.
primary identification
Два
by
різних етапи.
commanders are
Тобто
two
командир
different
не може
stages.
давати
So the
інструмент
commander
для
cannot
подолання стресу,
give a
якого ще
tool
не
to
наступило. Це є більш
overcome
все-таки,
stress that
це
has
трошки
not
інша
yet
робота.
happened. This is
Це
a
мають
different
займатися
kind
цим
of
психологи, які мають
work. A
кваліфіковано
psychologist
фахово
must engage
підходити і
in
робити це,
this,
чи в індивідуально, чи в груповому варіанті. Ну, скоріше за все,
whether it's
індивідуальному,
group thing
щоб
or
визначити цю.
individual
А от
thing.
виявлення, первинне виявлення, те, що
But
командири,
primary
помічники психолога,
identification,
це також це надзвичайно важливо. Але то, як на
it's
мене, то наступний етап.
it's crucial, but it's
дивись,
the next stage.
я тут трошки заперечу, і є цікаві інструменти. Ну, два навіть я назву.
I would
Перше,
disagree
це
here.
After Action Review, так?
There are
Дуже
interesting tools.
часто,
Let me mention
якби це була
after
б
action
дійсно
review, for
регулярна
example.
впроваджена
Very
практика
often, if it
обговорювати
is a
події,
regular
там, операції,
practice
так,
to discuss the
командирами,
events
я
and
думаю, дуже
the
багато би виявлялося.
operations, I
Це
believe that
перша
there
частина
would be
про
a
і
lot of
можна.
revelations, basically. This is the first thing.
І є певні види
And
дебрифінгів,
also, there are some
називаються,
types of
англійською
debriefing.
leaders-led after action debriefing. Це
Leaders
комбінація
led
АПД,
after
але там
action
ще включено, що командир,
debriefing.
власне,
This is
командир це
combination
проводить, що
of
командир ще
after action
питає про
debriefing,
твої
but the
реакції.
commander
Тобто не
is
тільки там,
involved.
як там
He
задачу
or she
виконували,
asks
що було
about
добре,
your
недобре,
reactions,
а
not
як ти
only
почувався,
about
і
what
тобто такі
was done
елементи.
well or not, but
Але
how you
психологи мали
were
би навчити
feeling.
командирів це
But
робити швидше.
psychologists
Тут я
should
все погоджуюсь. Але
teach
що
commanders to do
командир
that, of
завдяки
course,
своєму
I agree.
авторитету і
But
завдяки
the
тому, якщо
commander,
є
due
він,
to
звичайно,
the
авторитет, і довіра
authority,
до
if
нього,
there
він
is the
насправді має
authority and
набагато
trust
більший
for the
вплив на
commander,
своїх
of course,
підлеглих,
they have much more
ніж
influence on the
психолог, який,
subordinates than a
деколи це
psychologist
просто людина,
who,
так як
well,
я не знаю всю
sometimes
бригаду, зараз в нас бригада
I
ще
don't know
колошматова,
the
я
entire
її не знаю,
brigade,
тобто
right?
я часто
I
приїжджаю, і нові люди,
There
і
have
так, і
been a
поки
lot of
ти
changes, and I
станеш
often
своїм,
come
це
and see
багато
new
часу. І
people.
тут
It
якраз
takes
навички
time for them
командирів
to feel you
було б
as
добре.
one of their
Але,
guys.
звичайно, така
And there it would
операційна
be good to
обстановка,
develop
що командири
skills of
воюють, і їм
commanders. But of course, the situation is
не
such
вистачає
that
часу
commanders
для
are
комунікації якісно.
fighting in combat.
Так,
They don't have
хто
enough time for
піднімав?
communication. That's
Хто
true.
піднімав руки? Але ми
Someone
говоримо про
else?
якісь певні напрямки, так? Тобто, якщо
But
ми
we're speaking
шукаємо,
about certain
щоб не
approaches, right?
залишатися в безсиллі, бо
If
цього безсилля дуже багато на фронті,
we do not want
то
to
добре бачити
remain
хоча б якісь такі
like
промінчики,
helpless,
куди можна
because there is
розвиватися,
already a lot of helplessness in combat.
щоб все
So it
одно
would
це
be
робити.
good to
Наприклад, на
see
відновленні
some
там приділити увагу і
rays of
зробити
light,
там
some
тренінг для командирів.
orientations. What
Наприклад,
could be
що.
done, for example, to conduct a training for commanders when they are rotated
Друзі,
and moved
ми
to
вже
the
працюємо
rear.
годину 20, у нас ще є
And
близько
friends,
10
we've been
хвилин, ми так
working for
закладаємо півтори
1 hour,
години, щоб
20 minutes.
себе
We
не дуже
still have about
стримувати,
10
не
minutes.
сковувати.
We planned
Цікава
as
дискусія.
90-minute
бачу, Оксана
sessions in
підняла
order
руку.
to have a good
Будь
substantial
ласка.
discussion. It has been an interesting
колеги.
discussion.
Я
And now,
хочу
Oksana.
підняти питання, яке
Colleagues,
було і в чаті.
I would
Як ви
like to
ставитесь
address
до
an issue
того
that somebody
про
mentioned in the chat
евакуацію
box as well regarding
військових,
evacuation,
коли нема можливості евакувати далеко
where
для
there is
пунктів
no
першої психологічної допомоги.
possibility to
І як там
evacuate
краще
far, and
організовувати,
when
можливо,
they
когось
are
із
taken
досвід.
to first psychological aid points, and how to better organize that aid in that
Почули?
sense, close to the front line. Have you heard me?
Так, ще раз.
Can you
Пункти першої
repeat your
психологічної
question?
допомоги,
I mean,
коли немає
first
можливості
psychological aid
евакуювати
points
солдатів
or sites
далеко,
where it is
військових,
there is no
але
possibility
треба
to
їх
evacuate them far away,
забрати
but
з
you
підрозділу
still
на
need
певний час,
to
тому що
withdraw
там іде стресовий
soldiers
розлад.
from the
Як ви ставитесь до цього
unit because
і
they are in
який
that
у кого
process
є
of
досвід,
PTSD
можливо?
formation. So what do you think about that? And maybe you've had some
Ігор,
experience. Could we
потім
discuss that?
Сергій.
Ігор, Сергій.
Я можу, да, говорити? Оксана
Can
закінчила,
I?
да?
Oksana, you are
Вітаю
ready,
всіх,
right,
офіцер
for
групи
feedback.
контролю
I
бойового
am
стресу
the
3-ї
officer
штурмової.
of
Я хотів
combat
би
stress control
зазначити, моя
officer
суб'єктивна думка
group
як
of
командира
3rd
взвода
Assault
бойового
Brigade.
підрозділу,
I,
що
being a
дуже
commander,
мало
I believe that
приділяється уваги для
too little
проходження
attention is
бійців,
paid
які попадають, нові
to make
бійці на
sure
лінію,
that new
не
soldiers who
проходять
come to the front line,
психологічну смугу, да,
unfortunately,
саме
they
цю
do
вправу,
not
да, яку,
go
наприклад, я
through
проходив її
the
3 рази.
psychological
І я
training
знаю, що
preparation,
точно
this
вона
so-called
адаптує бійця до жорстких, да,
psychological
бойових умов максимально
trial
наближено.
line, because
Для
this is
того,
something
щоб
that
якраз
helps
в нього
the soldier
формувався,
to
да,
be
оця
ready for
адаптація
for
саме
what's
до
going to
бойового
happen.
стресу.
It is very
Щоб він
realistic.
міг
That helps
подолати
them
його, да,
develop
щоб він
adaptation to
знав, що
combat
таке
stress,
вихід
so that they
з
could overcome
ствола
that, so
танка
that
снаряда,
they
що таке прильот
knew
міномета,
how
що
the
таке FPV,
tank
яка літає.
or
Тобто все це
FPV
якраз в цій
drone,
психологічній
how
смугі
they
і є.
sound, or
Тому я
martyrs.
рахую,
So
що це
this
дуже
is what's
класний
included
інструмент
into
для
that
того, щоб
psychological
психологічно
training. I believe it
підготувати
is a very
бійця,
good tool that makes
який,
it
да, там,
possible to psychologically
невдовзі
train,
буде вже
prepare a
на лінії
soldier
фронту,
who
да, там,
very soon is going to go
відправлений
to the
командирами.
front line.
Яка ваша думка з цього
What
приводу?
do you
Хотів би теж
think
почути
about
колег.
that again? I also would
Ігор,
like to have
дуже
some
цікава тема, яку ви
feedback from
підняли,
colleagues.
але
Igor, that's
було
very
питання
interesting
попередньо, бо ви
topic.
дали ще
But
одне
we had
питання.
that previous question and you come up
Давайте ми
with
тоді,
another
якщо
question,
залишиться
right?
можливість, ми до нього
Well, if
повернемося, але було
we
питання про
still
пункти
have the
психологічної
opportunity, let's
допомоги,
try and go
то
back to that,
давайте
but
так, щоб по
let's
порядку
speak about first
черги.
this
Тоді Сергій, потім
first
Андрій
psychological
Карачевський,
aid
а там,
side.
якщо
So Serhiy,
відповідять,
Andriy,
можна повернутися до психологічної
and
смуги
then
теж.
we can go back to what has been just mentioned, psychological training. We have that experience in our brigade. We have first psychological aid site. Our brigade was one of the first brigades that made an emphasis there. But I would ask this question to Oksana, why you say that there is no possibility to evacuate? Because first psychological aid cannot be provided at the first or second line. You cannot provide psychological aid without ensuring safety, without the soldiers being in the situation of safety. You cannot work with a soldier who developed acute stress reaction. You cannot work with them when there are explosions, when they cannot relax. So the distance at which first psychological aid should be provided, it should be sufficient so that people could relax and feel safe. Then you can work with them. It is not possible if it hasn't happened. Sometimes psychologists, specialists, they go to the location where the soldier resides. We also do that, but again, this is not at the first line, not at the front line. It is still in the safer situation. But again, in order that the soldier could better overcome all of the stress reactions, if they are more or less okay mentally, in 3 or 4 days they can overcome that. So they have usually resources to overcome those reactions. But again, an important precondition, prerequisite there is safe distance. People should feel safe. And then the organism, the system can launch all of those resources that help overcome those reactions. So for us, it implies about 40 kilometers. It is a more or less safe distance. So if they bring someone with acute stress reactions, we work at that distance.
Так, до речі, пункти психологічної допомоги – це така
Thank
штука,
you. And
яка і в нас добре
first
прижилася,
psychological
із мого
aid
досвіду, і
sites, this is
універсальна, і
something that is
американці
quite
це
successfully
описують.
implemented.
Андрію,
I
будь
know
ласка,
that we
твоя
do
рука.
that. Americans describe that experience. Andriy, you are the next one.
Андрій Карачевський, будь ласка. Ну, виглядають якісь, певно, проблеми зі зв'язком, я думаю.
It seems that Andrei has some connection problems. Okay, Andrei, are you with us?
Андрію, кажи.
Andrei, go ahead.
Стосовно пунктів психологічної
Okay, regarding psychological aid
я
sites,
бачу два гарних приклади.
I see two good examples of that. Those are two brigades that are in Zaporizhia Oblast. So usually,
частіше батальйони
and most often,
підпорядковані іншим бригадам.
these battalions of territorial defense units, they are subordinated to other brigades. But in this case, these were two brigades that established this first aid sites not that far, not 40 kilometers away, but some 15 kilometers away, and that was actually sufficient for the soldiers to recover. That was quite a positive experience, but they complain, however, that when you provide this first psychological aid, you have to do a lot of paperwork. Otherwise, it seems to be working quite efficiently. And of course, it depends on the skills of the psychologists that the psychologists have there.
Групи контролю бойового стресу, все ж таки
combat stress control groups, different officers in different groups, they may have different skills, obviously, and not always they have the skills of proper psychological aid to support resilience, and this is what we should aim, basically, when we work in that format. So it's important training of those officers who work at psychological first aid sites. That requires training. Hope you can hear me. Yeah, we hear you.
Українська реальність зі зв'язком.
The Ukrainian reality is poor connection.
Добре, колеги, в нас лишається ще 2 хвилини, і так
we still have a couple of minutes, so let us try and summarize some of. I've been speaking a lot and you didn't hear me. No, we hear some of that. You stopped by stating that we need to focus on training those officers who work in first aid sites, and well, that's hard to disagree. Yeah, they need to know techniques for psychological recovery, low-intensity psychological interventions, so that they had the skill to do that. Right. Thank you.
Я тоді, певно, передам, мене не дуже добре виходить з підведення підсумків.
I am not very good summarizing, Carl. If possible, I would delegate that to you for you to sum up today's discussion.
Okay. One, I want to thank everyone for the wonderful, wonderful discussion. I learned a tremendous amount. I want to thank Jim and Tony and Ole and Oksana for all the support, and for all of you who didn't get a chance and wanted to say something. I think everyone has access to my email, Tony's, Jim's. We're happy to hear from you and happy to share information and share ideas. When you think about PIES, as I mentioned earlier, please think of it as a very early intervention. It's not a treatment. However, as psychiatrists, as psychologists, as clinical social workers, our tendency is to want to jump in and engage in treatment. That is not what PIES is. Tony put in the chat that PIES is probably best implemented by NCOs and leaders in the unit. They're spot on. I couldn't agree more. Maybe for our next seminar, we could talk about, because I think a lot of the issues, although nobody said it directly, is what happens if, as clinicians, as psychiatrists, as psychologists, as social workers, we get it wrong. What happens if we send somebody back to the front and they cause harm to themselves or somebody else? Or we evacuate them back, and that leads to this cascading of sort of sprinting to the rear phenomena. That's words we use in the US. So there are risks to behavioral health care providers, to mental health care providers, that we could get it wrong. We're not perfect. We're making assessments, we're making judgments. And with assessments and judgments, we're going to make some mistakes. But I think we saw that we consult with others. Oleg gave an example where he consulted with others. Tony gave examples where he consulted with others. So consult with each other, sort of, maybe I'm missing something. So, but again, PIES is just a concept. It's one type of intervention. There are many, many other types of psychological first aid, because I think PIES fits in that broad category. And there's other types of very quick, brief interventions. And we can talk about those in future webinars if there's interest in doing that. PIES I think, has a long, long history. It's sort of that juxtaposition between mission first, or soldiers always, right, as Tony said, and it creates a dilemma for us as mental health care providers. So I'm going to stop there because I'm already 2 minutes over. But again, thank you all very much, and we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks' time.
It's not good to add after Carl, but I will try. Carl, thank you very much. You have amazing gift to conceptualize things, and I'm just thinking, that we have the question about psychological obstacle line, and I hope we can answer in the future. And I was thinking that true prevention, really true prevention, maybe the first prevention that we should make, but we don't have luxury to make, is psychological selection. But we don't have this luxury. So then we have all people that we can have, and then we have somehow to support them in all possible ways. Thank you very much. In 2 weeks, we have some more to add.